Not unemployed, not in crisis, not someone who gave up. They did everything right, and tonight, that car is the only home they have. This is happening in ordinary neighborhoods. In parking lots, you've driven past 100 times without looking twice. And here's what makes this hard to wrap your head around. The real number of people living like this is significantly larger than anything officially reported. Nobody's measuring this right. And by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why and how it's probably closer to you than you think. Before we go anywhere else, let's clear up the image most people have when they hear the word homelessness. Tents on a sidewalk, someone sleeping in a doorway downtown. That image exists, and it's real. But it's only one version of what's happening. And it's the version that's easiest to see. People living in vehicles look nothing like that. They park in commercial lots after closing time. Quiet side streets. Industrial zones where foot traffic drops to zero at night. During the day, they go to work, stop at the library to use the restroom, or pay for a gym membership they barely use, except for the shower. From the outside, they're invisible. And that invisibility isn't an accident, it's survival. Because the moment you become visible in this situation, consequences come fast. Here's why that matters. If you can't see this crisis, you can't count it. And if you can't count it, it's very easy for the people who are supposed to fix it. Hundreds of thousands of Americans are living in their vehicles for at least part of the year. In Los Angeles County alone, tens of thousands of... The same pattern keeps showing up in San Diego, San Jose, Seattle, Portland, and increasingly in cities you might not expect, like Phoenix, Denver, Las Vegas, and Austin. Those numbers are already significant. But here's what gets buried. They're almost certainly too low. America measures homelessness through something called a point-in-time count. One night, once a year, when volunteers go out and try to count everyone without stable housing. For people sleeping in visible spots, the method works reasonably well. For vehicle dwellers, it fails almost completely. These are people who move around specifically to avoid being noticed. They park somewhere different every few nights. Not because they're hiding anything, but because being found usually means a ticket, a tow, or being told to move on. Experts consistently say the real number is substantially higher than official figures suggest. We're dealing with a crisis that's larger than anyone is measuring, affecting people who are almost impossible to see, and it starts somewhere most people would never expect. Here's something that still surprises alarm. They commute, they clock in, they get a paycheck, and when the shift ends, they go back to their car. Researchers call this population the working homeless. Every time someone hears that phrase for the first time, there's usually a pause, because it sounds like a contradiction. It isn't. It's just arithmetic. When a full-time job pays wages that don't cover what it costs to rent even a modest apartment, the outcome isn't complicated. You can't afford housing. That's the whole equation. And the gap between what jobs pay and what housing costs has grown enormous. In many major American cities, rents climbed 30 to 40% over the past decade, higher in some markets. Meanwhile, wages in service jobs, retail, logistics, and healthcare support, the work a huge portion of Americans actually do, have barely kept pace. In many cities today, you'd need to earn more than $25 an hour just to afford a basic one-bedroom apartment without spending more than a third of your paycheck on rent. For someone earning minimum wage, that gap isn't just large. It's the kind of gap you don't climb out of. Have you seen this happening in your city? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious where people are noticing this most. Housing economists use something called the 30% rule as a basic benchmark. Keep your housing costs under 30% of your income, and you have enough room left over for food, transportation, healthcare, and the things that come up unexpectedly. Go above 30%, and that margin starts disappearing. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. According to housing research, roughly 40% of renters in the United States are alone. A substantial share of those are at 50% or more. Think about what that means in practical terms. If half your paycheck is gone before you buy a single grocery or pay a single utility bill, what happens when something goes wrong? Because something always goes wrong. And here's how housing loss actually happens, because it almost never looks the way most people picture it. There's a widespread assumption that homelessness was time to course correct. For most vehicle dwellers, that's not what happened. The trigger was fast. The fall was faster. Picture a two-income household where rent already takes up 50% of what they bring in together. One of them loses their job. Unemployment benefits, where available, rarely come close to covering full rent in a high-cost city. Savings, if there are any, might stretch a month or two. Then the math stops working. Landlords can't wait indefinitely. Eviction moves quickly. Within weeks, not years, that family no longer has housing. Medical debt follows the same path. In the United States, a single hospital stay can produce bills in the tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes in just a few days. For families without solid insurance coverage, the choice narrows fast: pay the medical bills or keep paying rent. For many, it isn't really a decision. It's just a sequence of consequences. Fall behind on rent, and eviction begins. Divorce creates a different version of the same problem. One household splitting into two means both people need independent housing at the same time, in a market where a one-bedroom costs $1,500 to $2,000 a month or more. For people on average wages, that arithmetic often doesn't work. What consistently surprises researchers is the speed. How quickly a household that looks stable from the outside can completely lose its footing, not over years, sometimes over weeks. And once the place. Here's the part that tends to get overlooked. To rent an apartment after losing one, you typically need a security deposit, a landlord reference, and a credit history that survived the disruption intact. Most vehicle dwellers don't have those things, not because they weren't responsible, but because losing housing tends to take all of them with it. So they can't compete in the rental market. The vehicle that was supposed to be a temporary solution becomes a longer-term one. Days become weeks, weeks become months. And the longer someone stays in a vehicle, the harder it gets to get out. Economists describe this as the cost of being poor. The idea that financial instability doesn't just reflect a lack of resources, it actively creates additional costs that make it harder to rebuild. Parking tickets when you can't always find a legal spot. Impound fees when a ticket goes unpaid. Repair bills when the car that's also your home breaks down. For someone with financial stability, these are inconveniences. For someone without it, any one of them can be genuinely catastrophic. Without a stable mailing address, applying for assistance programs gets harder. Managing bills, maintaining credit, accessing basic banking, all of it becomes more difficult the longer you're in the situation. The things that could help you get out become harder to reach the longer you stay in. Now, let's talk about what actually created this, because it didn't happen by accident. The housing affordability crisis driving vehicle homelessness has been building for more than a decade, but it accelerated sharply in recent years, and inflation played a significant role in that. When the cost of groceries, utilities, fuel, and healthcare all rise at the same time, households already at the edge don't have anywhere left to cut. Something has to give, often the housing payment itself. Inflation also flows into housing costs in less direct ways. Higher construction costs, rising property taxes, and increased operating expenses for landlords get passed down to tenants through higher rents. And in competitive rental markets, those increases can happen quickly and with almost no warning. At the same time, wages haven't kept up. Workers in service and retail jobs, which represent a large share of the American workforce, have seen their real purchasing power stagnate or quietly decline, even in years when their nominal pay technically went up. When everything costs more but your paycheck doesn't change, the buffer you were counting on just disappears. It's worth noting that inflation isn't the only force at work here, but it's a significant accelerant on top of structural conditions that were already making housing harder to afford. The result is that the population genuinely at risk of housing loss has expanded well beyond people who were already struggling. It now includes workers who, in a different economic environment, would never have had a housing problem at all. Here's something that tends to genuinely surprise people. The shortage of affordable housing in America is not a natural market outcome. It's a policy outcome. Decades of zoning restrictions blocked the construction of multifamily housing in high-demand areas. Investment in public and subsidized housing fell well short of what population growth required. Affordable rental stock was steadily converted into higher-priced units. These weren't accidents or inevitable forces. They were specific decisions, made over many years, with consequences that were entirely foreseeable. The result is a market where supply is constrained, demand stays strong, and landlords have little incentive to hold prices steady. Rents go up, vacancy rates fall, the pressure on lower-income renters intensifies. And here's how thin the margin is. A rent increase of just $100 to $200 a month can be enough to push a family over the edge if they were already spending most of their income on housing. That's not a dramatic event. That's just a Tuesday. Let's make this concrete, because numbers alone can start to feel abstract. Over 1 million students in the United States experience some form of homelessness each year. Federal education guidelines classify students living in cars, motels, shelters, or other temporary housing as homeless students, and school districts are legally required to track this population. A meaningful share of that 1 million are living in vehicles with their families right now. Think about what that actually looks like. A kid who slept in a car last night still walks into school this morning, still has to sit down, focus, take notes, and pass tests. Still has to navigate the social dynamics of being a teenager, while quietly carrying the weight of making sure nobody finds out, making sure they look like everyone else. That is an enormous thing to carry, and it isn't neutral in its effects. Research on childhood housing instability consistently finds measurable harm, lower academic performance, disrupted emotional development, and mental health effects that don't simply resolve once stable housing is found. The damage accumulates in real time, while the family is still trying to hold things together. If this has given you a clearer picture of what's actually going on, a like helps more people find it. Takes 1 second. Now, here's where most people assume there's a safety net waiting. If someone loses their housing, they can just go to a shelter, right? That assumption is wrong in most American cities, most of the time. Shelters in high-cost cities operate at or near capacity. In some areas, wait lists stretch for weeks or even months. Walking in on any given night and finding a bed available is not something people can reliably count on. But even when space exists, the conditions create real barriers for families who need to stay employed. Many shelters require residents to leave by a fixed morning hour and return only in the evening. For someone working a night shift or a job with variable hours, that schedule simply doesn't work. Some facilities separate adults by gender, meaning a family that arrives together gets split up to access services. For most parents, that's not an acceptable arrangement. Safety and privacy are also genuine concerns. In overcrowded facilities, theft, conflict between residents, and a complete lack of personal space are commonly reported. For families with children, those conditions can feel more threatening than staying in a locked vehicle where they control who gets in. Shelters also typically impose time limits, a few weeks, sometimes a month, before residents are expected to have transitioned to permanent housing. In a market where affordable units are scarce and competition is intense, that time frame is rarely enough. Families cycle back out with the same unresolved situation they arrived with. So many people who lose their housing skip the shelter system entirely. Not out of pride, because a vehicle is the more practical option given the actual constraints they're facing. And here's where it gets harder. Cities across the country have passed laws restricting, and in some places outright prohibiting, sleeping in vehicles. Overnight parking restrictions, anti-habitation ordinances, designated area prohibitions. Depending on the city, any combination of these can make it effectively illegal to sleep in your own car. The consequences fall directly on people who have almost no capacity to absorb them. A parking ticket runs $50 to $100 in many cities. For someone with a minimal weekly budget, that's not trivial. When tickets go unpaid because there's genuinely no money, vehicles get booted or towed. Recovery fees can reach several $100s. For someone whose car is simultaneously their shelter and their way to get to work, losing that vehicle isn't just a transportation problem, it's losing housing, instantly. Housing advocates consistently argue, and the evidence supports this, that enforcement without housing provision doesn't reduce vehicle homelessness. It relocates it. People move to the next street, the next lot, the next zone. The underlying situation stays exactly the same. You're not solving the problem, you're just making it less visible to the people who complained about it. In cities where vehicle homelessness has become most concentrated, what advocates call vehicle encampments have become a visible part of the urban landscape. These are areas, industrial corridors, commercial lots, stretches near highway on-ramps, where clusters of cars, vans, and RVs gather in spots where residents can stay for more than a night or two without being immediately forced out. In some cities, entire blocks are lined with inhabited vehicles. Over time, something unexpected develops in these places. Informal networks form. Residents share information about which lots are less frequently cleared, where to find food or hygiene services, which outreach workers are actually helpful. A real sense of community can take shape among people who never planned to be neighbors, but without sanitation infrastructure or regular waste collection, conditions deteriorate. And when cities respond, which they eventually do, usually with a cleanup operation, it doesn't address a single reason those people are there. Residents move. The encampment reconstitutes nearby. The cycle repeats. You can move the symptom. You can't sweep away the cause. It's worth pausing for a moment on what daily life inside this situation actually looks like, because most people have never had reason to think about it. Every night means finding a legal place to park. That sounds straightforward. It isn't. Overnight parking restrictions exist throughout most cities, and the nightly search for a safe legal spot creates a kind of low-grade, persistent anxiety that doesn't let up. Access to a restroom, shower, or clean water requires constant problem-solving. Library restrooms work during operating hours. Mobile non-profit outreach fills some gaps, but availability is inconsistent. Extreme weather is a genuine physical danger. In summer, the interior of a parked car can reach dangerous temperatures within minutes, particularly in the southwest. In winter, hypothermia is a real risk in cold climates. These aren't rare scenarios. They're recurring features of vehicle living that have to be actively managed. Sleep is almost never fully restorative. The constant low-level fear of someone knocking on the window, police, security, a property owner, keeps most vehicle dwellers in a state of light, anxious rest throughout the night. Over weeks and months, that kind of chronic sleep disruption compounds every other challenge. And for parents, there's a psychological weight on top of all of it. Mental health research on this population consistently documents elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and trauma. Those effects don't reset when stable housing is eventually found. They carry forward. Some cities and organizations have started working directly on this. And while what exists falls well short of what's needed, it's worth understanding what actually helps. The most developed response so far is the Safe Parking Program. These are designated lots, run by non-profits, local governments, or institutions like churches, where vehicle dwellers can park overnight without risk of tickets, towing, or being told to move. Many provide portable restrooms, basic security, and access to social workers who help participants navigate housing applications, job services, and healthcare. Cities including San Diego, Santa Barbara, and Los Angeles have implemented versions of these programs. The evidence indicates they do make a meaningful difference. Participants experience more stability, better safety, and higher rates of eventually moving into permanent housing when paired with active case management. Non-profit organizations also provide mobile hygiene services, food assistance, and outreach workers who spend time building genuine trust with vehicle-dwelling communities before connecting them to resources. But the honest assessment is this: the scale of these programs is nowhere close to matching the scale of the problem. Safe parking capacity in most cities serves a fraction of the vehicle-dwelling population. Access is limited by geography, wait lists, and eligibility. And none of it addresses the underlying conditions pushing people into vehicles in the first place. Which brings us to the question this whole video has been building toward. When a significant portion of the people living in vehicles are employed, going to work, paying taxes, raising children, how do you explain that? It can't be personal failure. These people are doing the work. The explanation has to be structural. Housing costs have outpaced wages for a large portion of the American workforce over a sustained period. The supply of affordable housing has declined, and the financial safety net hasn't been strong enough to absorb the shocks, job losses, medical emergencies, family disruptions that push households into crisis. Economic inequality runs through all of it. At the top of the income distribution, housing wealth has grown. Asset values up, equity building, financial buffers deepening. At the bottom, real wages stagnated, while housing costs consumed an ever larger share of income. Buffers were thin or non-existent to begin with. And here's what often gets missed. The instability is spreading. Households that genuinely appeared financially stable, employed, housed, managing expenses, have proven vulnerable to housing loss at a speed that caught even researchers off guard. The margins have thinned across a much wider range of the income spectrum than most people recognize. This isn't just a crisis for people who were already on the edge. It's becoming a crisis for people who never thought they were near it. There's one thing that's important to say clearly, because it often gets lost. Vehicle homelessness is not an unsolvable problem. The housing shortage is a policy outcome, not a law of nature. It was shaped by specific decisions. Zoning restrictions that blocked multifamily construction in high-demand areas, underinvestment in public housing, conversion of affordable units to higher-priced ones. Those decisions created this. Decisions in the other direction can change it. The wage-to-housing gap isn't a permanent feature of the economy either. When labor markets are strong and wage policy is aligned with real costs, wages do rise relative to housing. The gap we're seeing reflects a specific set of conditions, not an unchangeable reality. Healthcare costs as a driver of homelessness reflect how the American insurance system is structured, leaving millions exposed to catastrophic out-of-pocket bills. That's a design choice. It can be redesigned. None of this means the solutions are simple or politically easy. But it does mean this crisis has identifiable causes, and those causes can be addressed. It is not random. It is not inevitable. It will keep growing until the responses match the actual scale of the problem. Those fogged up windows on a cold morning. The car in the back corner of the lot that hasn't moved in days. That's the visible edge of something much larger. Hundreds of thousands of people who are working, raising kids, trying to stay healthy and employed while managing the daily reality of not having a home. These are not people who fell through the cracks. They are people the system was not built to hold. As long as housing costs rise faster than wages, as long as the supply of genuinely affordable housing keeps shrinking, as long as a single job loss or medical bill can wipe out years of stability in a matter of weeks, this will keep growing. The scale of it, the speed of it, the breadth of who it's now reaching, all of it points to the same conclusion. Something in how American housing works has broken down in a fundamental way. Not because of bad luck or bad people. Because of specific choices that were made, and specific ones that weren't. What gets built, what gets funded, what finally gets changed, that's still a choice. And it hasn't been made yet. What do you think would actually move the needle on this? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments.